Apparently, this is one of the least Metroid games of all time. Well, I guess it's time for this Metroid noob to play it and find out if that's indeed true. For the sake of humanity. Hey there, all you beautiful guardians of the glaze. Welcome back to the Milky Donut. If you're new here, this is the Milky Donut. We do all things video games, movies, and pop culture. And if you're not new here, you seem pretty cool. Do you want to be friends? I need friends. Well, before we yet again jump back into our video game time travel machine, I would like to mention that I do have a goal of reaching 10,000 subscribers as quickly as I can. So if you enjoy, don't forget to like the video, leave the glaziest of comments, hype it if you can, and subscribe if you think it's worthy of the algorithm. As always, shout out to the current subscriber of the week, Mr. Albert Levins 9191. And with all that nonsense out of the way, let's jump back into our video game time travel machine and play apparently the worst Metroid game of all time for the very first time. If there's one thing this journey through older games has taught me so far up until this point, it's that my first impressions are all too often completely wrong. When I decided to explore the Metroid series, I expected another Nintendo franchise whose reputation was just another one of those overly praised franchises that over the years eventually reaches unrealistic expectations because of being called the greatest of all time for so long. Well, instead, I found one of the most influential and atmospheric series I've ever played. Super Metroid completely blindsided me with how immersive it was, proving that a game didn't need long, self-indulgent cutscenes or constant dialogue to tell an unforgettable story. As a matter of fact, if you've seen my Super Metroid video, you know that it actually became one of my top 5 favorite games of all time. Planet Zebes felt so alive despite its complete isolation, and simply existing within that world became one of the most memorable gaming experiences I've ever had. Naturally, curious to see where those ideas began, I went back even further and played the original Metroid on the NES, which I also made a video on. Although, sure, it did show its age in plenty of ways, which we'll get into later, but it also revealed just how much of the series' identity had been there from the very beginning. The atmosphere, along with non-linear exploration, gradual progression through new abilities, and interconnected world, all existed decades before they were perfected in Super Metroid. Once I finished both games, there was really only one place left to go. The next stop on our video game time travel journey was Metroid Fusion. Super Metroid absolutely convinced me that loneliness and complete isolation were the franchise's greatest strengths, which, they are, but Fusion challenges that assumption from the very moment you start playing. Instead of dropping Samus onto another mysterious planet with little to no explanation, it begins by establishing one of the most important events in the entire series, of course, according to my research. During an expedition to SR-388, Samus becomes infected by a life form known as the X-Parasite, an organism so dangerous that conventional weapons are completely ineffective against it. Well, that infection spreads throughout her body so rapidly that doctors are forced to surgically remove large portions of her power suit just to save her life. Her only chance of survival comes through an experimental vaccine created from Metroid DNA. It sounds pretty safe to me, while permanently altering her biology in the process. The treatment grants her immunity to the X, but it also just so happens to leave her vulnerable to extreme cold, of course, one of Metroid's defining weaknesses. Before the gameplay even begins, Fusion establishes a protagonist who is more fragile than I had ever seen her, physically weakened, stripped of nearly every ability she once possessed, and sent to investigate an outbreak involving creatures capable of perfectly copying any living organism they encounter. Straight away, that opening drastically changes the tone of the adventure. Previous Metroid games relied almost entirely on environmental storytelling, allowing you to piece together the world's history through exploration rather than exposition, and that was also one of my favorite parts of the games I had previously played. Fusion, however, places a much greater emphasis on narrative, introducing regular dialogue, recurring story events, and objectives that move the plot forward. On paper, that sounded like exactly the sort of direction I usually criticize, and if you've been a guardian of the glaze for any amount of time, you'd know that as well. One of the biggest reasons Super Metroid left such an astronomical impression on me was because it trusted me. It trusts you to become lost, to remember locations that would eventually become important later on in your adventure, and to absorb the god-tier atmosphere without ever interrupting the immersion. Fusion adopts a much more structured approach by introducing Adam, who's an artificial intelligence modeled after Samus's former commanding officer, who briefs you before nearly every major mission and directs you towards your next objective. Coming directly from Super Metroid, I'll admit I felt a little pit in my stomach because I expected this change to undermine everything I loved about this series so far. Having someone tell me where to go felt completely at odds with what Metroid had become in my mind. Yet the more I played, the more I realized the game wasn't abandoning the series' identity so much as it was shifting the player's motivation. Adam may assign objectives and point you toward the next destination, but he rarely explains how to reach it or how to get there, which is really what matters at the end of the day. Hidden passages still have to be discovered, environmental obstacles still demand experimentation, and new abilities continue to reshape the station in familiar Metroid fashion. The destination is usually pretty clear, but the path remains yours to uncover, allowing Fusion to preserve much of the exploration that defines the series while framing it within a stronger narrative. Instead of replacing exploration, Fusion simply gives it a different context. You're no longer wandering through an alien world purely out of curiosity. You're responding to an escalating crisis, you're investigating strange outbreaks, and restoring damaged systems, all while attempting to contain an organism capable of wiping out entire civilizations. The result is a game that feels considerably more focused without completely sacrificing that satisfaction that comes from gradually unlocking the world around you. It isn't trying to recreate the feeling of being completely alone on planet Zebes, because that's not the story it wants to tell. You see, my beautiful guardian of the glaze, Fusion understands that the quickest way to feel like a lesser version of Super Metroid would have been trying to imitate it, rather than establish its own identity, and once I stopped expecting another Super Metroid, I found myself appreciating what Fusion was actually trying to accomplish. As a newcomer to the series, one of the best surprises was realizing that this more structured approach never actually prevented the game from feeling unmistakably Metroid. Beneath the heavier emphasis on story, that same great sense of discovery remains intact, and that becomes even more apparent once the game introduces its setting. Rather than exploring another forgotten planet, nearly the entire adventure takes place aboard the Biological Space Laboratory's research station, better known as the BSL. You know what? Butts aside, we could call it the Bad Bitches Laboratory with Samus walking around, I'm not that far off, but anywho's, at first I wasn't convinced that a giant research facility could possibly capture the same atmosphere as Zebes, and I absolutely love mysterious atmospheric celestial bodies and exploring them, so I was again a bit worried. But the further I ventured into the station, the more obvious it became that Nintendo had approached the setting with way more creativity than I had anticipated. Stepping aboard the BSL research station was the moment I realized Fusion had absolutely no interest in simply repeating what came before it. There were to be no cases of sequelitis today, boys and girls. After 2 games set on liminal alien worlds, I expected another lonely planet filled with forgotten ruins and ancient Chozo architecture, which I admit I wanted, because those environments had become inseparable from my idea of what Metroid was supposed to feel like, so the thought of spending an entire game inside a research facility sounded like a considerable slog. Again, on paper, a giant laboratory doesn't exactly inspire that same sense of mystery as an unexplored planet does, but thankfully, Nintendo understood that concern and built the station in a way that constantly disguises its artificial nature. Instead of forcing you through endless boring sterile hallways, the BSL is divided into huge research sectors, each recreating a completely different ecosystem. Very smart, Nintendo, very smart indeed. Dense jungles, volcanic caverns, frozen environments, underwater laboratories, and even dimly lit biological preserves all exist within the same station, making each area feel distinct despite sharing a common setting. Every so often, you'll catch a small glimpse of the station's steel framework or mechanical infrastructure, reminding you that everything around you has been carefully engineered. But those moments only reinforce the illusion instead of breaking it. The Game Boy Advance deserves a tremendous amount of credit for selling that illusion. I've talked a lot over the past several videos about how well pixel art has aged, and Fusion is another perfect example of why I continue to believe that strong artistic direction will almost always outlast technical realism. Every environment has its own color palette, personality, and visual identity, allowing each sector to feel immediately recognizable despite any hardware limitations that may be present. Nothing here is trying to win you over with graphical fidelity. Instead, the game focuses on the things that matter, like great atmosphere, expressive animation, and environmental detail, creating locations that remain visually striking more than 20 years later. The more retro games I play, the more convinced I am that good art direction is far more important than trying to create perfectly realistic graphics, and Fusion reinforces that idea at every opportunity. The station's overall layout was also something that caught me off guard, because Super Metroid revolves around one enormous interconnected world where every new upgrade gradually transforms your understanding of the map, rewarding careful observation and memory. Fusion takes a completely different approach by organizing the station around a central hub known as the main deck, with elevators leading to each research sector. Initially, I again was worried that this structure would eliminate one of my favorite aspects of the series. Learning the geography of ZBs, slowly mastering its shortcuts, and becoming more efficient at moving through familiar territory made progression feel incredibly rewarding. Dividing that world into separate sectors sounded like it might reduce the sense of discovery, but to my surprise, it actually solved one of the few frustrations I occasionally had with the NES Metroid. When Adam assigns you a new objective, you're rarely forced to retrace enormous stretches of the map simply to reach the next destination. I like backtracking as much as the next guy if it's done to near perfection like it was in Super Metroid, but Nestroid occasionally started to feel a bit grindy. Well, in Fusion, you travel directly to the appropriate sector, allowing the pacing to remain consistently engaging without sacrificing exploration. And that doesn't mean that backtracking disappears. Nearly every area is revisited multiple times over the course of your adventure, but those return trips always reveal something new for you to discover. As usual, previously inaccessible passages become reachable through newly acquired abilities. Environmental changes reshape familiar rooms, and the growing X-Parasite outbreak gradually transforms sections of the station that once felt completely safe. Revisiting old locations never feels like you're just retracing your steps because the world never remains static for very long. The constant evolution helps preserve one of the series' defining strengths that we all know and love. And even though Adam does provide clear objectives, the station still encourages experimentations in ways that I found to be engaging and fun. Hidden passages remain hidden, and reaching our destination often requires a lot more problem solving than the navigation computer initially suggests, and that's important because it preserves that feeling of discovery without leaving players completely directionless, again like in Nestroid. Super Metroid encouraged exploration by asking, where should I go next? Fusion replaces that question with, how do I reach the place I know I'm supposed to investigate? It's a subtle diversion, but one that allows the game to maintain its Metroid identity while embracing a more structured narrative. And by the time I had settled into that rhythm, I stopped worrying about whether Fusion was too linear, and started appreciating how effectively it balanced direction with exploration. It never felt like the game was solving problems for me, it just gave those problems context within a narrative. Every assignment was connected to an ongoing crisis. How? Well, every newly opened sector represented another stage of the outbreak, and every return trip reinforced the feeling that the station was slowly spiraling out of control. That growing sense of unease quietly builds beneath the surface for the first few hours, but it doesn't truly reveal its purpose until Fusion introduces the game's greatest idea. Up to this point, the X-Parasites exist mostly as a terrifying concept. You're told they can perfectly imitate living organisms, absorb memories, and inherit every ability possessed by their host, basically complete assimilation. But simply being told about those abilities and actually experiencing their consequences are two very different things. Fusion understands that horror often comes from anticipation rather than immediate confrontation, allowing the threat to linger in the background while you slowly piece together just how dangerous these creatures really are, letting your imagination do a lot of the heavy lifting, something I've spoke about before when talking about horror. SAX I genuinely believe is one of my favorite antagonists in the entire Regress series, not because it delivers unforgettable dialogue or possesses an elaborate personality, but because of what it represents. Throughout nearly every Metroid game, Samus eventually becomes the strongest thing in the room, our favorite muscle mommy. Progression isn't simply measured by new abilities, it's measured by confidence. Areas that once seemed intimidating gradually become places you can sprint through without hesitation because every upgrade makes you stronger than the world around you. Well, Fusion completely dismantles that expectation by introducing an enemy that possesses every weapon, every movement ability, and every combat instinct Samus had before the events of the game. You're not facing an equal, you're facing the version of yourself that hasn't been weakened. It's pretty much like in Logan, when Logan had to fight his clone that was cloned from peak Wolverine DNA, and we all know how that went. The first encounter with the SAX completely changed my approach to the game. My instincts told me to prepare for a boss fight, but Fusion makes it clear that fighting isn't an option. Survival depends entirely on avoiding confrontation and waiting for an opportunity to escape while listening to the unmistakable sound of the SAX stalking the corridors above you. Great atmosphere. For the first time in the series, Samus isn't the hunter, she's the prey. If the BSL research station establishes Fusion's identity, the SAX is what defines it. The X-Parasites are already unsettling on their own because assimilations are a very scary thing, at least for me. I think the Thing is one of the scariest creatures ever to be put on film. But rather than simply killing their victims, they absorb their memories, their instincts, and their physical abilities before perfectly replicating them. Every creature they infect becomes something familiar on the surface, but fundamentally different underneath, and that's always been an unsettling concept to me. But Fusion doesn't reveal its greatest consequence until the parasite encounters Samus herself. The result is of course the SAX, a perfect copy of Samus before the events of Fusion stripped away her abilities. Every beam upgrade and every missile, every movement option, and every combat instinct remains intact, creating an enemy that isn't simply stronger than you, it's the fully realized version of the character you spent the entire series becoming. It's a simple idea, but one that completely changes the relationship between you as the player and the world. At least in the 2 Metroid games that I've played, and believe me, I'm no Metroid connoisseur, I've only played 2 games, but for the most part, progression is about becoming the most dangerous thing in the room, at least in my opinion. Fusion makes you survive in a world where you're no longer the apex predator. Hearing its footsteps echo through the station while it patrols overhead creates a kind of tension that's completely different from anything I'd experienced in the series so far. Instead of carefully searching every corner for hidden upgrades like I usually would, I found myself watching doors and listening for movement and planning escape routes long before I ever needed them. What makes these encounters so great isn't that they happen often, it's that they permanently change how you view the station once they've occurred. Once you know the SAX is somewhere aboard the BSL, every quiet hallway feels less predictable, keeping the gameplay engaging. Areas that once encouraged careful exploration suddenly carry a sense of uncertainty because you never know when the game's greatest threat might appear. Fusion turns familiar environments into places of constant unease without relying on cheap jump scares or excessive scripted moments. The fear comes from anticipation and tension rather than surprise, allowing your imagination to do far more work than any cinematic sequence could ever do. The soundtrack plays a huge role in creating that fantastic atmosphere as well. Super Metroid used eerie ambient music to emphasize isolation, making Planet Zebes feel ancient and abandoned. Fusion takes a more dynamic approach, matching its faster pacing with music that carries greater urgency. But whenever the SAX appears, that energy disappears almost immediately. The soundtrack strips away any sense of comfort and replaces it with anxious, unsettling melodies that creates a sense of danger before the enemy ever even enters the screen. By the middle of the game, I wasn't reacting to the SAX itself so much as reacting to the music that signaled its arrival. Fusion trains your subconscious to associate those sounds with immediate danger, creating tension way before anything actually happens. And that constant sense of vulnerability completely transforms progression, because from what I've experienced, every upgrade in Metroid represents another step towards complete mastery. New weapons make combat easier, and new movement abilities expand the world. Fusion still delivers that satisfying progression, but every upgrade serves a second purpose. Each new ability closes the gap between you and the SAX, making progression feel like survival rather than a simple empowerment. I wasn't collecting upgrades just to reach previously inaccessible areas anymore. Your boy was preparing for the inevitable moment when running would no longer be an option. That's ultimately what separates Fusion from the other 2 games that I've played. Super Metroid built suspense by making me feel completely alone in an unfamiliar world, while Fusion builds suspense by making me feel hunted in one that's becoming increasingly more familiar. Both games do create tension through vulnerability, but they arrive in completely different packaging. Fusion's tactics are fundamentally different approaches to horror, but it's every bit as effective. One area where Fusion never feels like a compromise is its gameplay. After spending so much time talking about the story and atmosphere, it's easy to forget just how good the game actually feels to play. Samus controls nicely, with faster acceleration, tighter movement, and far more forgiving wall jumps that make navigating the station feel all the more satisfying. Super Metroid remains one of the greatest games that I've ever played, but Fusion thrives within its own unique identity. After finishing Super Metroid, I assumed every great Metroid game would need to recreate that same feeling of complete isolation. But Fusion proves that that's not completely true. It replaces loneliness with a stronger narrative and near-complete player freedom with a more focused structure, yet it never loses sight of what makes the series so compelling. Exploration still remains rewarding, and every new ability continues expanding both the world and your understanding of it. The formula evolves without sacrificing its identity, and that realization did change the way I look at the series as a whole. Because although I've only played a few Metroid games up to this point, each entry seems to build upon the last while still having the confidence to establish its own identity. Super Metroid is still my favorite of the 3, and I suspect it always will be. Few games have immersed me within their worlds quite the way that Planet Zebes did, and it's honestly not even close. But Fusion never needed to be Super Metroid Part 2 to earn its place alongside it. If this journey has taught me anything so far, it's that Metroid earned its legendary reputation one game at a time. The original laid the groundwork while Super Metroid perfected it into one of the greatest games ever made, and Fusion proved that that formula could evolve without losing its soul. 3 games, each taking a different approach, each succeeding for different reasons, and together they form one of the strongest runs I've experienced in my retro gaming journey so far. And with that, we come to the end of our time travel journey. As always, I had an absolute blast playing Metroid Fusion, and I absolutely don't think it deserves to be hated on the way I've seen it has been on the internet. And hopefully I was able to shed some positive light on this absolute banger. But do you prefer old games or new games? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to see more of this, feel free to drop what you'd like to see next in the comments. Yes, even if you've already commented your request 10 times, don't be afraid to comment them again, because it's always possible that they get lost in the comments, and I want to see all of the recommendations that I can. As always, don't forget to like, comment, hype, and subscribe to become a guardian of the glaze, and I'll see you next time on the Milky Donut.